The Rhine had never been merely a river. For 2 millennia, it had served as the natural fortress of Germania, the barrier that halted Caesar's legions, that divided Charlemagne's empire, that Napoleon himself had respected at the height of his continental dominance. No enemy had ever forced the Rhine against determined German resistance without bridges. This was not military doctrine. This was historical law. By March 1945, even as the Reich crumbled under the weight of 2 converging fronts, Wehrmacht commanders held one absolute certainty: the Rhine would buy them time. Perhaps weeks, perhaps months, perhaps long enough for the miracle weapons, the jets, the rockets, the whispered projects in underground factories to change the mathematics of the war. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, had stated it plainly in a February briefing. The enemy may reach the Rhine, they cannot cross it. The river is 400 meters wide with march currents exceeding 2 meters per second. Every bridge has been demolished. Our 88mm guns have every potential crossing point registered. Let them come. Let them try. The defensive preparations reflected this confidence. Since September 1944, German engineers had transformed the eastern bank into a fortress in depth. 3,000 concrete positions, interlocking fields of fire, artillery pre-sighted on every bend, every beach, every conceivable landing point. The Wehrmacht had spent 5 years perfecting the art of river defense from the Dnieper to the Seine, and the Rhine represented the culmination of that expertise. The doctrine was elegant in its simplicity. Rivers imposed sequence. Attackers needed assault boats, vulnerable, slow, requiring multiple trips. They needed engineers working under fire to construct pontoon bridges. They needed time to establish bridgeheads before armor could cross. Each phase created opportunities for defenders to mass fire, to counterattack, to destroy crossing points before they could be exploited. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring's orders to all Rhine defenders embodied this certainty. The enemy will require 48 to 72 hours minimum to establish viable bridgeheads. Our mobile reserves will have ample time to respond. German intelligence had done its work, or believed it had. Wehrmacht analysts had compiled extensive reports on Allied equipment observed in Normandy, Italy, and southern France. Among the documented vehicles were curious boat-shaped trucks designated in German reports as Schwimmwagen LKW, swimming trucks. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wenzel of 15th Army Intelligence had reviewed these reports personally. His assessment, filed February 12, 1945, was dismissive. Dukw amphibious trucks observed in beach landing operations, specialized equipment for coastal assaults, no strategic relevance to river crossing operations, estimated 75 to 100 vehicles total in European theater. Classification, curiosity of American industrial excess, similar to ice cream ships in prefabricated harbors. The assessment had been circulated to all major commands. No one questioned it. Why would they? The Americans had always been wasteful, producing equipment for every conceivable specialized task, but rivers weren't beaches. Rivers required different capabilities, different doctrine, different mathematics entirely. On the evening of March 23, 1945, German observers along the Rhine watched American artillery flash in the gathering darkness and felt the satisfaction of men who had prepared perfectly for the battle ahead. They had no idea they were watching the beginning of the end. Not of a battle, of an entire way of warfare. April 1942, Provincetown, Massachusetts. While German engineers were perfecting the Tiger tank, a masterpiece requiring 300,000 man-hours of precision craftsmanship, a Coast Guard patrol boat ran aground on a Massachusetts sandbar. Conventional rescue trucks couldn't reach it through surf and sand. This minor inconvenience would destroy the Rhine defense. Palmer Coslet Putnam didn't see a rescue problem. He saw a conceptual gap in amphibious warfare. Working with yacht designer Roderick Stevens Jr., he sketched a solution: a truck that could drive seamlessly from water to land. Not a specialized vehicle for elite units, a mass-produced tool that any soldier could operate. Ford Motor Company reviewed the proposal and declined. The timeline was impossible. The engineering challenges insurmountable. General Motors accepted it on April 23, 1942. 41 days later, the first Dukw prototype rolled out of the Pontiac, Michigan factory. This was the fundamental difference German intelligence never grasped. When Germany needed better tanks, they engineered the Panther, sophisticated, powerful, requiring specialized parts and skilled labor. Production peaked at 3,100 units over 2 years. When America needed amphibious capability, they tooled an assembly line to produce 525 Dukws per month. By war's end, 21,047 vehicles, each costing $10,750, each requiring minimal training to operate. each capable of carrying 5,000 pounds of cargo or 25 combat troops from ship to shore to inland deployment. The Dukw wasn't elegant, it was adequate. But there were thousands of them. German intelligence saw them in Sicily, Salerno, Normandy. Analysts dutifully filed reports describing Schwimmwagen operating in beach landings. The vehicles were noted, categorized, and dismissed. Beach equipment, coastal operations only. The reports estimated perhaps 100 existed in the entire European theater. By March 1945, over 2,000 Dukws operated in Europe alone. The U.S. Army had organized them into specialized amphibious truck companies, each with 50 vehicles and trained crews. They'd practiced river crossing operations for months, developing doctrine and tactics on the Maas River. The British had received 1,000 units through Lend-Lease. Canadian forces operated 800 more. Wehrmacht intelligence officers weren't incompetent. They were victims of their own conceptual framework. German military culture valued craftsmanship, specialization, elite performance. A vehicle that could operate on land and water seemed like a compromise, adequate at neither, master of nothing. Surely such hybrid equipment was a curiosity, not a strategic weapon. They calculated that even if Americans used these vehicles for Rhine crossings, the numbers would be insufficient. Perhaps a company or two for specialized tasks. The real assault would still require traditional methods, assault boats, pontoon bridges, sequential operations taking days to complete. On March 22, 1945, hundreds of Dukws sat in concealed staging areas within 5 miles of the Rhine, each mechanically inspected, each waterproofed, each loaded with precise cargo manifests. Drivers had practiced for weeks, routes were mapped, artillery coordination was finalized, navigation lights were tested. German observers across the river noted increased vehicle traffic but saw nothing alarming. Americans always had excessive logistics, probably supplies for the lengthy bridging operations that would be required. Hauptmann Werner Kessler wrote in his evening report, "Enemy continues massing forces opposite our positions. No unusual activity observed. Defensive preparations remain adequate for expected assault timeline." Adequate for a war that no longer existed. Irrelevant to the one about to begin. March 23, 1945, 1700 hours. The world became sound. Over 3,500 Allied guns opened fire simultaneously. British 25-pounders, American 155mm howitzers, 240mm monsters that seemed to tear the air itself apart. Gefreiter Heinrich Müller, manning an observation post near Wiesel, attempted to count muzzle flashes and stopped at 500. The western bank had become a solid line of flame stretching to both horizons. Not individual explosions, he would later tell interrogators. One continuous roar. The earth shook. Dust fell from the bunker ceiling. We couldn't hear our own officers shouting orders. For 4 hours, the eastern bank disintegrated under steel rain. German doctrine said this was the prelude. Softened defenses, then would come the vulnerable assault boats, then the exposed bridgeheads, then the slow, methodical bridge construction that defenders could target, counterattack, destroy. At 2100 hours, something else came instead. The first Dukws rolled down the western bank and entered the Rhine without pause. No staging, no hesitation, engines roaring, propellers churning. They simply drove into the river as if it were another road. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the 7th Battalion Black Watch sat in the lead vehicle. The driver, American lad, couldn't have been 20. He just kept his foot down. We hit the water and I thought we'd sink, but the Duck just kept going. The engine note changed, the propeller caught, and we were moving across, 12 of us in full kit, and this bloody truck was driving across the Rhine. Behind him, dozens more followed, then hundreds. German observers couldn't process what they were seeing. Lieutenant Klaus Brenner radioed battalion headquarters. Enemy vehicles entering the water. They are not sinking. Repeat, vehicles are crossing without boats. Request clarification. The response came back, impossible, confirm assault boats. Negative. These are trucks, truck-shaped boats, they're driving across. Silence on the radio, then maintain observation, report bridgehead locations. But there were no bridgeheads, that was the horror of it. Traditional assault boats would shuttle back and forth, building up forces at specific points. German doctrine knew how to respond. Mass artillery on the bridgehead, counterattack with mobile reserves, destroy the crossing point before it could be reinforced. The Dukws weren't creating bridgeheads, they were creating highways. Each vehicle drove across, climbed the eastern bank, and simply continued inland, depositing troops miles from the river before returning for another load. There was no concentration point to target, no bridge to destroy, no sequential buildup to disrupt. Feldwebel Otto Kraus watched in disbelief as shapes emerged from the darkness on his side of the river, not where he'd been told to expect them, but everywhere at once. We heard engines, behind us, beside us. They hadn't landed, they'd driven inland. How do you counterattack something that's already past you? Radio discipline collapsed. Reports flooded headquarters. Enemy behind our positions. Vehicles moving east unchallenged. Where is the crossing point? There is no crossing point. They're everywhere. Commanders demanded bridge locations for artillery. There were no bridges. They ordered reserves to attack bridgeheads. There were no bridgeheads. By midnight, over 500 DUKWs had crossed. The Rhine wasn't being forced. It was being ignored. And German doctrine, perfected through 5 years of war, had nothing to say about enemies who could turn rivers into roads. March 24th, 1945, 0300 hours. The DUKWs didn't stop. Traditional river crossings had natural pauses. Time required to shuttle troops across in boats, to construct bridges under fire, to consolidate bridgeheads before advancing. The Rhine crossing had no pauses. Every 7 minutes, another DUKW reached the eastern bank. Every 7 minutes, another squad deployed miles inland. The river had become an assembly line delivering combat power. By dawn, over 1,000 crossings had been completed. 12,000 Allied troops operated on the eastern bank, not clustered in vulnerable bridgeheads, but dispersed across a front of nearly 20 miles. Oberst Heinrich Wiebig, commanding the 84th Infantry Division, submitted a situation report that captured the Wehrmacht's conceptual paralysis. Enemy strength unknown, enemy locations unknown, no identifiable main effort, recommend immediate withdrawal to secondary defensive line. The request was denied. Higher headquarters still believed this was a conventional assault that could be contained once the actual crossing points were identified. But the crossing points were everywhere. Lieutenant James Mitchell, 819th Amphibious Truck Company, made 6 runs across the Rhine that night. By the 3rd trip, we weren't even taking fire. The Germans were pulling back, not in organized retreat, just pulling back. Their whole defensive plan was built around stopping us at the river. Once we were past it, they didn't know what to do. The DUKWs brought more than troops, ammunition, medical supplies, radio equipment, artillery pieces. By 0600 hours, 25-pounder guns were firing from positions 3 miles east of the Rhine. Guns that had crossed in DUKWs, been driven to firing positions, and unlimbered without requiring bridge construction. German counterattack doctrine required identifying the main crossing point and concentrating armored reserves against it. Soviet's Panzer Corps, Germany's mobile reserve, received contradictory orders throughout the night. Attack bridgehead at Weasel, then cancel enemy main effort at Reese, then disregard multiple crossing points identified. By dawn, the Panzer Corps hadn't moved. Commanders couldn't identify where to concentrate their already insufficient armor. At 1,000 hours, the sky filled with parachutes. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, dropped 16,000 British and American paratroopers directly onto German rear positions. Over 1,000 transport aircraft and gliders darkened the sky. Supplies, artillery, even vehicles fell from the air. Gefreiter Anton Müller watched from his position near Hammenkoln. We thought we understood the battle, then they came from the sky. Thousands of them, our officers said, reinforced the river, but the enemy was already behind us, in front of us, above us. Wehrmacht communications dissolved into chaos. Unit after unit reported being surrounded, cut off, bypassed. The defensive line hadn't broken, it had simply ceased to be relevant. By evening of March 24th, Allied forces held a continuous front 15 miles deep. Engineers were constructing bridges now, not to enable the crossing, but to support it. The tactical surprise was complete. The operational surprise was total. The strategic surprise was absolute. German commanders had prepared perfectly for a battle. The Allies had fought a different war. Feldmarschall Kesselring's situation map showed red symbols penetrating everywhere, following no logical pattern, creating no identifiable main effort. In the margin, his staff officer had written a single word: unmöglich, impossible. But it was happening. The Rhine had fallen in 18 hours. It's March 26, 1945, 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine. Germany's sacred barrier no longer existed as a military obstacle. Over 300,000 Allied troops operated on the eastern bank. Pontoon bridges now spanned the river, not because they were needed for the assault, but because the assault had already succeeded. The Rhine had become what the DUKWs had made it, a highway, not a barrier. The collapse wasn't measured in miles captured, but in will destroyed. Wehrmacht units that had fought ferociously for every village in the Rhineland simply disintegrated. Not through casualties, through comprehension. If the Rhine couldn't stop the Allies, nothing could. The miracle that German commanders had promised, that the river would buy time for wonder weapons, for negotiated peace, for something other than total defeat, had evaporated in 3 days. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Leithsbury Corps, surrendered his entire command on March 28th. His statement to interrogators was stark. After the Rhine crossing, resistance became meaningless. We had told our men the river was uncrossable. When it fell in a single night, they stopped believing anything we told them. Mass surrenders accelerated. Entire battalions walked into Allied lines. By April 1st, over 300,000 German soldiers had been captured in the Ruhr pocket. not through encirclement and siege, but through the evaporation of hope. Supreme Allied commanders recognized what had occurred. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his post-battle assessment, wrote, "The Rhine crossing demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly applied, renders traditional defensive doctrine obsolete. We did not storm Fortress Europe. We manufactured our way through it." Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, never generous with praise for American methods, admitted grudgingly, "The amphibious trucks performed beyond any reasonable expectation. What we anticipated would require a week of intense combat was achieved in hours." Winston Churchill, visiting the Rhine on March 25th, stood on a pontoon bridge and reflected, 2,000 years ago, Caesar looked across this river and decided Rome's boundary lay here. Yesterday, young men drove trucks across it as if it were a country lane. The world has changed more in this war than in all the centuries prior, and then the DUKWs changed purpose entirely. By mid-April, as combat operations wound down, the same vehicles that had shattered German defenses began carrying refugees, displaced persons, relief supplies. The boat-shaped trucks that had been instruments of war became instruments of reconstruction, ferrying civilians across rivers whose bridges lay destroyed, delivering food to populations facing starvation, evacuating wounded from field hospitals. Sergeant Robert McPherson, who had crossed the Rhine in the first wave, spent May 1945 transporting German civilians. Strange thing that, 3 weeks earlier, I'd have shot them. Now I'm helping an old woman and her grandchildren cross the river because they're trying to get home. Same duck, same river, different war. The DUKW remained in service for decades after, in Korea, in disaster relief, and civilian use. But its defining moment was those 3 days in March 1945, when American factories proved that geography was no longer destiny, that barriers existed only until someone built enough machines to ignore them, and that the Rhine, unconquered for 2 millennia, could be rendered irrelevant by industrial imagination applied at scale. The war in Europe ended 6 weeks later, but it truly ended the night the DUKWs crossed. Don't just watch and subscribe while help WW2 Archives hit 1,000 subscribers.